In the vast expanse of the Galactic Military Academy, where beings from hundreds of worlds trained side by side, there existed an unspoken truth that every species understood: never underestimate the quiet ones. The Zephyrians learned this lesson in blood and broken bones when they decided that Marcus Chen, the soft-spoken human cadet who spent his free time reading ancient Earth literature, would make an easy target for their ritualistic hazing. What they didn't know was that Marcus carried within him the genetic memory of a species that had clawed its way from the primordial soup to the stars, not through superior technology or natural advantages, but through sheer, unrelenting determination and an almost supernatural ability to turn desperation into devastation. When Instructor Vexay arrived at Training Base 7 expecting to find another routine bullying incident to break up, what he discovered instead would shake the foundations of everything the galaxy thought it knew about humanity. The bay was silent except for the soft whisper of the ventilation system, and Marcus Chen sitting calmly in the center of the room, his Academy-issued training uniform barely wrinkled, reading a book of ancient Earth poetry while surrounded by the unconscious forms of 12 Zephyrian cadets who had learned too late that some prey fights back. This is the story of how one quiet moment changed everything. The morning bells of the Galactic Military Academy rang across the crystalline towers of Nexus Prime, their harmonious tones designed to appeal to the auditory preferences of over 300 different species. Marcus Chen opened his eyes in his small dormitory cube, the familiar weight of homesickness settling in his chest like it did every morning. 6 months into his training at the most prestigious military institution in the known galaxy, and he still felt like an outsider looking in. He swung his legs over the edge of his regulation sleeping platform and reached for the small leather-bound book on his nightstand. The worn copy of Earth poetry had been a gift from his grandmother before he left for the academy. The other cadets found it strange that he read physical books instead of accessing digital libraries through neural interface like everyone else. But Marcus treasured the weight of real pages in his hands. "Another day in paradise," he muttered to himself, a phrase his father used to say during difficult times on the family farm back on New Montana. Marcus dressed quickly in his academy uniform, the dark blue fabric with silver threading that marked him as a first-year cadet. The mirror reflected back a young man of average height, with dark hair and quiet brown eyes, that his instructors often noted seemed to absorb everything around him. The corridor outside his cube buzzed with morning activity as cadets from dozens of species prepared for another day of training. The Zephyrians dominated the hallway with their imposing 7-foot frames and metallic blue skin that seemed to shimmer under the artificial lighting. Their voices carried easily over the chatter of smaller species, discussing their weekend victories in the combat simulators with the casual arrogance that came naturally to apex predators. Marcus kept his head down as he walked, a strategy that had served him well throughout his time here. The Academy prided itself on fostering cooperation between species, but the reality was that old hierarchies died hard. Predator species like the Zephyrians and the reptilian Sorax naturally gravitated toward leadership positions, while smaller herbivorous species often found themselves relegated to support roles. Humans, being relatively new to the galactic community and from a death world that most species considered barely habitable, occupied an uncertain middle ground. The mess hall was a cacophony of sounds, smells, and colors, as hundreds of cadets from across the galaxy gathered for the morning meal. Marcus grabbed his standard nutrition packet and found an empty table near the viewport overlooking the Academy's training grounds. He pulled out his book and began reading while he ate, losing himself in the familiar rhythms of ancient Earth verse. "What's the little human reading today?" The voice belonged to Zefkar, the unofficial leader of the Zephyrian cadets. Marcus didn't look up from his book, hoping the group would move on if he didn't engage. "I asked you a question, dirt dweller." The insult was delivered in the Zephyrian's native language, but the universal translator ensured Marcus understood perfectly. Zefkar's massive hand slammed down on the table, making Marcus's meal tray jump. "Poetry," Marcus said quietly, still not looking up. "Earth poetry. A chorus of clicks and whistles erupted from the group of Zephyrians surrounding his table. In their culture, clicking indicated amusement, and Marcus realized he had just become the subject of their entertainment. Poetry? Zefkar's voice dripped with disdain. No wonder your species is so weak. You fill your minds with useless words, while real warriors train their bodies. The Zephyrian reached down and plucked the book from Marcus's hands before he could react. Please give that back, Marcus said, his voice remaining calm despite the anger building in his chest. It's important to me. Important? Zefkar flipped through the pages with deliberate carelessness. What could possibly be important about this primitive scribbling? Perhaps we should see if it can fly. Marcus stood slowly, his movements controlled and deliberate. Around the mess hall, other cadets began to notice the confrontation. Conversations quieted as attention focused on the human and the group of Zephyrians. Marcus was aware that every interaction like this was being evaluated by his peers. Show too much weakness, and he would be marked as prey for the rest of his time at the academy. Show too much aggression, and he would be labeled as unstable and potentially dangerous. The book belongs to me, Marcus said, extending his hand. I'm asking politely for you to return it. Zefkar looked around at his companions, all of whom were now fully engaged in the drama unfolding. And if I refuse? What will the little poet do then? Marcus felt the familiar sensation he had experienced countless times throughout his life when pushed too far. It started as a warm pressure in his chest and slowly spread outward through his limbs. His grandmother had called it the fire that burns quiet, and she had spent years teaching him to control it. On New Montana, where the native wildlife could tear apart an unprepared human in seconds, learning to harness that fire had been a matter of survival. Then I suppose we'll both learn something new today, Marcus replied, his voice carrying an undertone that made several nearby cadets take an instinctive step backward. Zefkar's metallic blue skin flushed to a deeper shade, indicating rising aggression in his species. Is that a threat, human? Are you actually threatening me? He towered over Marcus by more than 18 inches and outweighed him by at least 50 pounds of pure muscle. No, Marcus said, meeting the alien's gaze steadily. It's an observation. The mess hall had gone completely quiet now. Even the serving staff had stopped their work to watch the confrontation unfold. Marcus could see other human cadets scattered throughout the room, their faces showing a mixture of concern and resignation. This wasn't the first time one of their kind had been singled out for harassment, and it likely wouldn't be the last. Zefkar made a show of considering the book in his hands before deliberately dropping it to the floor. The ancient pages scattered across the polished metal deck, some torn from their binding. Oops, he said with mock concern. How clumsy of me. Marcus looked down at his grandmother's gifts scattered across the floor, pages that had survived the journey from Earth to New Montana and then across the galaxy to Nexus Prime. Pages that contained the words his grandmother used to read to him during the long winter nights when the storms raged outside their dome habitat. Words that connected him to a world he might never see again and to a family history that stretched back centuries. The fire in his chest flared brighter, but Marcus forced himself to kneel and begin gathering the scattered pages. His hands moved with careful precision, treating each torn fragment as if it were precious beyond measure. The Zephyrians watched him with obvious satisfaction, their clicking laughter filling the silence. "Look at him crawl," one of them said in their native tongue, "like the ground-grubbing vermin his ancestors were." Marcus continued collecting the pages, his movements never hurrying despite the humiliation burning in his throat. When he had gathered the last fragment, he stood and carefully placed the ruined book in his uniform pocket. Only then did he look up at Zefkar. "You've made your point," Marcus said quietly. "I hope you feel satisfied." "Not quite," Zefkar replied, his voice carrying a note of cruel anticipation. "I think there's still more to learn about human poetry. Training Base 7 is unoccupied this afternoon during free period. Perhaps you'd like to come and recite some of your pretty words for us." We're very interested in Earth culture. The other Zephyrians clicked their approval at this suggestion. Marcus knew exactly what kind of cultural exchange they had in mind. Training Base 7 was in the remote section of the academy, far from the main corridors and the oversight of instructors. It was the perfect place for the kind of lesson that left no witnesses and no evidence beyond whatever injuries might result. "I'll be there," Marcus said, surprising everyone within earshot, including himself. Zefkar's head cocked to one side in genuine confusion. "You will?" 1,400 hours, Marcus confirmed. Training Bay 7. The Zephyrians exchanged glances, clearly not having expected this response. They had been prepared for pleading, for attempts to involve Academy authorities, for anything except calm acceptance of their invitation. "Excellent!" Zefkar recovered his composure. "Don't be late, poet. We have so much to teach you about the real world." Marcus nodded once and turned to leave the mess hall. Behind him, he could hear the excited chatter of the Zephyrians as they discussed what they would do to him that afternoon. Other cadets gave him a wide berth as he walked, their expressions ranging from pity to curiosity to outright fear. They all assumed they were looking at someone who had just signed his own death warrant. Marcus made his way through the academy corridors to his afternoon classes, but his mind wasn't on tactical analysis or xenobiology. Instead, he was thinking about his grandfather's stories from the early days of human colonial expansion. Stories about settlers who faced impossible odds against hostile environments and even more hostile native life forms. Stories about humans who learned that sometimes the only way to ensure peace was to make the cost of aggression too high for anyone to pay. During advanced combat theory, Marcus found himself studying the physiological data on Zephyrian anatomy that appeared on his display screen. He noted the location of nerve clusters, the density of their metallic skin, and the weak points that existed in every biological structure, regardless of how formidable it appeared. Professor Kethmal, an elderly crystalline who had served in 3 interstellar conflicts, Cadet Chen, the professor's voice resonated through the classroom like wind chimes. "You seem particularly interested in Zephyrian physiology today. Is there something specific you'd like to discuss?" Marcus looked up to find the entire class staring at him. "Just trying to understand how different species might approach combat differently, Professor." Academic curiosity. Professor Kethmal's crystal formations shifted in a pattern that indicated thoughtfulness. An admirable pursuit. "Remember, young cadet, that understanding your opponent is often more valuable than overwhelming them. The greatest victories in military history have been won not through superior force, but through superior knowledge." "Yes, Professor," Marcus replied, making a note in his personal files. Superior knowledge. When the class ended, Marcus made his way to the Academy's historical archives. As a first-year cadet, his access was limited, but he was able to pull up general information about human military conflicts throughout history. He scrolled through records of ancient Earth wars, colonial conflicts, and the various skirmishes that had occurred as humanity expanded into the galaxy. A pattern began to emerge as he read. Humans rarely won through technological superiority or physical dominance. Instead, they won through adaptability, through their willingness to use unconventional tactics, and through what military historians called escalation asymmetry, the human tendency to respond to threats with a level of violence that was completely disproportionate. Marcus thought about the torn pages of his grandmother's book, still folded carefully in his uniform pocket. He thought about the looks of satisfaction on the Zephyrians' faces as they watched him crawl around, collecting the scattered fragments. He thought about the weeks of small humiliations and casual cruelties he had endured since arriving at the Academy, all in the name of maintaining the peace and proving that humans could adapt to galactic civilization. But there was another kind of adaptation, Marcus realized. There was the adaptation that happened when a species was pushed too far and decided that the cost of maintaining peace was higher than the cost of war. As the afternoon wore on, Marcus made his preparations with the same quiet efficiency he brought to everything else. He stretched his muscles using techniques his grandfather had taught him, exercises derived from the martial arts that human colonists had developed during the early expansion period. He reviewed everything he had learned about Zephyrian combat doctrine during his months at the academy. He thought about his grandmother's words about the fire that burns quiet, and how sometimes that fire was the only thing standing between survival and extinction. When the Academy chronometer indicated 13:45, Marcus made his way toward Training Bay 7. The corridors in this section were largely empty during free period, most cadets preferring to spend their time in the recreation areas or the observation lounges. His footsteps echoed softly off the metal walls, a steady rhythm that reminded him of the drumbeat his grandfather used to tap out while telling stories about the old days. At exactly 1400 hours, Marcus Chen entered Training Bay 7. The Zephyrians were already there, 12 of them arranged in a loose circle around the center of the room. They had removed their academy uniforms and were wearing simple training clothes that would be easier to clean afterward. Zephyr stood at the center of the group, his metallic skin gleaming under the harsh Training Bay lights. "The poet arrives on time," Zephyr announced to his companions. "How wonderfully punctual." "I was beginning to worry you might have reconsidered our cultural exchange." Marcus walked slowly to the center of the room, noting the positions of each Zephyrian and the distance to the nearest exit. The bay was designed for combat training, with reinforced walls and floors that could withstand significant impact. There were no monitoring devices active. The Zephyrians had made sure of that before he arrived. "I keep my word," Marcus said simply, stopping in the center of their circle. "You wanted to hear some poetry?" The Zephyrians clicked their amusement, the sound echoing off the Training Bay walls. Zephyr stepped closer, looming over the smaller human. "Oh, yes. We're very eager to hear your pretty words. But first, I think we need to teach you some proper respect. You see, poet, there are hierarchies in this galaxy that your species doesn't seem to understand. There are predators, and there is prey. There are the strong, and there are the weak. Today, you're going to learn which category you belong in." Marcus nodded thoughtfully. "That sounds educational. Should I recite something before we begin, or after?" Zephyr's head cocked to one side in confusion. "After what?" "After you learn your lesson," Marcus replied, his voice carrying the same quiet tone he had used throughout their confrontation in the mess hall. The Zephyrian's metallic skin flushed deeper blue. "My lesson? What could a weak little human possibly teach us?" Marcus smiled for the first time since entering the training bay. It wasn't a pleasant expression. "You're about to find out why humans have a saying, 'Speak softly and carry a big stick.'" The stick, in this case, being the fact that my species climbed to the top of the food chain on a world where everything was trying to kill us, and we did it without claws, without armor, without venom, and without any natural weapons except our minds and our absolute refusal to give up. The fire that burned quiet began to spread through Marcus's limbs, and for the first time in months, he stopped trying to contain it. Instead, he let it flow through him like his grandmother had taught him, like his grandfather's stories had shown him, like 10,000 years of human survival instinct demanded. Zephyr raised his massive fist and Marcus Chen stopped being the quiet cadet who read poetry in the mess hall. In that moment, he became something much older and far more dangerous. A human being who had finally decided that enough was enough. The first strike came faster than Zephyr expected. For all their size and natural advantages, Zephyrians were accustomed to intimidating their opponents into submission before any actual violence occurred. They relied on their imposing presence and the psychological impact of their metallic hide to end confrontations before they truly began. What Zephyr didn't understand was that Marcus Chen had grown up on a world where hesitation meant death, where the local predators didn't waste time on intimidation displays before they attacked. Marcus moved with a fluidity that seemed impossible for someone who had appeared so passive moments before. His first target wasn't Zephyr himself, but the Zephyrian's leading knee. Marcus dropped low and drove his shoulder into the joint with surgical precision. using the alien's own considerable weight against him. The metallic skin that protected Zephyrians from most forms of damage did nothing to reinforce the connective tissue beneath, and Zefkar went down with a sound like a falling tree. The other 11 Zephyrians reacted with the shocked surprise of predators who had suddenly realized they might actually be in a fight rather than participating in a one-sided beating. They moved to surround Marcus, but he was already in motion, flowing from his attack on Zefkar into a spinning kick that caught the nearest alien in the solar plexus. The impact drove the air from the Zephyrian's lungs and sent him staggering backward into 2 of his companions. "Impossible," one of them gasped in their native tongue. "He's just a human." Marcus had spent his childhood learning to fight creatures that were faster, stronger, and better armed than he was. The shadow wolves of New Montana could move faster than human reflexes could follow, so his grandfather had taught him to fight preemptively, to attack where his enemies would be rather than where they were. The crystal bears had hide that could turn aside projectile weapons, so he had learned to target the vulnerable points that every living creature possessed regardless of its natural armor. The Zephyrians had advantages that the wildlife of New Montana lacked: intelligence, coordination, and training, but they also had disadvantages. They had been raised in a culture where their physical superiority was taken for granted. They had never learned to fight desperately because they had never needed to. They approached combat as a demonstration of dominance rather than a struggle for survival. Marcus, on the other hand, had learned to fight the way humans had always fought, with vicious efficiency and an absolute commitment to victory regardless of the cost. The next Zephyrian who reached him was Vector, Zefkar's second-in-command, and widely regarded as one of the most skilled hand-to-hand combatants in their class. He moved with the fluid grace of a trained warrior, his strikes precise and economical. Under normal circumstances, he would have been more than a match for a human cadet. But these were not normal circumstances, and Marcus was no longer thinking like a cadet. He was thinking like a colonist whose family farm was under attack, like a settler whose survival depended on his ability to hurt his enemies more than they could hurt him. When Vector threw a perfectly executed combination of strikes, Marcus didn't try to block or counter in any conventional sense. Instead, he stepped inside the alien's guard and wrapped his arms around Vector's torso, pinning the Zephyrian's arms against his sides. "What are you doing?" Vector demanded, struggling against the unexpected grapple. In Zephyrian combat doctrine, grappling was considered beneath the dignity of a warrior. It was something that weaker species did when they couldn't win through skill and strength. "Teaching you about human poetry," Marcus replied, and drove his forehead into Vector's nose with enough force to shatter the cartilage. The Zephyrian's metallic skin protected him from cuts and bruises, but it did nothing to cushion the impact against the delicate structures of his face. Vector dropped to the deck, both hands clutched to his ruined nose, blue blood streaming between his fingers. The remaining 9 Zephyrians had finally overcome their shock and were converging on Marcus from all sides. In their native environment, pack tactics were their greatest strength. They had evolved as cooperative hunters, able to bring down prey much larger than themselves through coordinated attacks and superior numbers. Marcus could see the tactical intelligence behind their movements as they spread out to surround him. They were no longer underestimating him, which meant this was about to become significantly more dangerous. But he had advantages they didn't know about. Lessons learned in an environment where making a mistake meant becoming something else's dinner. The shadow wolves of New Montana hunted in packs too, and Marcus had spent years learning to survive when outnumbered and outmatched. The key was never to fight the pack as a whole, but to isolate individual members and eliminate them before they could coordinate their attacks. It meant constant movement, staying ahead of their tactical planning, and using the environment to his advantage. Training Base 7 was designed for combat exercises, which meant it was filled with obstacles and equipment that could be weaponized by someone creative enough to see the possibilities. Marcus grabbed a gravity weight from the nearest equipment rack and hurled it at the head of the Zephyrian moving to cut off his escape route. The alien ducked, exactly as Marcus had expected, putting him off balance just long enough for Marcus to dive between his legs and roll toward the center of the bay. "Stop running and fight!" one of the Zephyrians roared, their metallic skin now flushed almost black with rage and exertion. "I'm not running!" Marcus called back, circling around a set of parallel bars. "I'm hunting." The distinction was lost on the Zephyrians, but it would have been immediately clear to anyone from New Montana. Running was what prey did when it wanted to escape. Hunting was what predators did when they wanted to kill. Marcus feinted toward the left side of the bay, drawing 3 of the aliens after him, then reversed direction and caught the nearest one with a devastating elbow strike to the throat. Zephyrians were proud of their metallic skin, but their internal structures were just as vulnerable as any other species. The alien went down choking and gasping, clutching at his damaged windpipe. 8 left. The pack coordination was beginning to break down as individual Zephyrians let their anger override their tactical training. They had come here expecting to humiliate a weak human, to demonstrate their superiority through casual violence. Instead, they found themselves in a real fight against an opponent who seemed to anticipate their every move. Marcus rolled under a low kick and came up behind another Zephyrian, wrapping his arm around the alien's throat in a chokehold his grandfather had taught him for dealing with crystal bears. The Zephyrian clawed at Marcus's arm, but the human had positioned himself in the blind spot where the alien couldn't bring his superior strength to bear. Within seconds, the lack of blood flow to the brain did what brute force could not, and another Zephyrian dropped unconscious to the deck. "Don't set up for texting. 7 left." "This isn't possible," Zefkar gasped from where he lay on the floor, still clutching his damaged knee. "Humans aren't warriors. You're farmers and merchants and poets." Marcus paused in his circling long enough to look down at the injured alien. "We're farmers who learn to fight to protect our crops. We're merchants who learn to fight to protect our trade routes. And we're poets who learn to fight to protect our words." He touched the pocket where the fragments of his grandmother's book rested. "You destroyed something precious to me. Now you get to learn why that was a mistake." The remaining Zephyrians charged him all at once, abandoning any pretense of tactics in favor of overwhelming force. It was exactly what Marcus had been maneuvering them toward. In the confined space of the training bay, they got in each other's way, limiting their ability to use their natural advantages effectively. Marcus dropped to the deck and swept the legs of the lead attacker, sending him crashing into 2 of his companions. He rolled aside as another Zephyrian's foot slammed into the deck where his head had been moments before, then grabbed the alien's ankle and twisted with all his strength. The sound of tearing ligaments was audible even over the chaos of the fight. 6 left. The battle had been raging for less than 3 minutes, but it felt like hours to the participants. Marcus moved through the remaining Zephyrians like a force of nature, using every dirty trick his grandfather had ever taught him about fighting multiple opponents. He threw sand from the equipment storage bins into their eyes, used the parallel bars to limit their movement, and exploited every environmental advantage the training bay offered. Most importantly, he fought with the absolute ruthlessness of someone who understood that showing mercy to an enemy was just another way of letting them hurt you later. When a Zephyrian went down, Marcus made sure they stayed down. When an opponent showed weakness, he exploited it without hesitation. 5 left. 4, 3. The final 2 Zephyrians stood back to back in the center of the training bay, their metallic skin now dull with exhaustion and stress. They looked around at their unconscious companions with expressions of disbelief and growing fear. "This is impossible," one of them whispered. "We're apex predators. We've ruled our homeworld for 10,000 years. And we've been fighting for our survival for 200,000 years," Marcus replied, wiping blue blood from a cut on his cheek. "The difference is that we never forgot what that means." He advanced on the final 2 opponents with the same quiet determination he brought to everything else in his life. But now that determination was focused like a laser on a single objective, making sure that no one would ever think of humans as easy prey again. The last 2 Zephyrians fell within seconds of each other. their superior size and strength no match for an opponent who fought with the accumulated wisdom of every human who had ever faced impossible odds and refused to surrender. Marcus Chen stood alone in Training Bay 7, surrounded by 12 unconscious Zephyrians. His academy uniform was torn and stained with alien blood, both theirs and his own. His hands shook slightly with adrenaline and exhaustion, but his breathing was already returning to normal. He walked over to where Zefkar lay semi-conscious on the deck and knelt beside the alien's head. The Zephyrian's metallic skin had gone pale with shock and pain. "You wanted to hear some poetry," Marcus said quietly, pulling the fragments of his grandmother's book from his pocket. "Here's one I particularly like. It's called Invictus, and it was written by a human poet named William Ernest Henley." He began to recite from memory, his voice carrying easily through the silent training bay. "Out of the night that covers me, black as the pit from pole to pole, I thank whatever gods may be for my unconquerable soul." Zefkar's eyes focused on Marcus with an expression of something approaching terror. This wasn't the same quiet human who had been reading poetry in the mess hall just hours ago. This was something much more dangerous, a predator who had been disguised as prey. "In the fell clutch of circumstance I have not winced nor cried aloud. Under the bludgeonings of chance my head is bloody, but unbowed." Marcus stood and carefully folded the torn pages back into his pocket. Around him, the training bay was a testament to what happened when someone pushed humanity too far and learned that there were consequences for their actions. "The poem goes on," Marcus told the semi-conscious Zephyrian, "but I think you get the point. Humans may be quiet, but we're not weak. We may prefer poetry to violence, but that doesn't mean we've forgotten how to fight. And when we do fight, we don't stop until the job is finished." He walked toward the exit of Training Bay 7, leaving behind a scene that would be talked about in whispers throughout the academy for years to come. Behind him, Zefkar struggled to sit up, his damaged knees screaming in protest. "Wait," the Zephyrian called out weakly. What are you?" Marcus paused at the doorway without turning around. "I'm exactly what you thought I was. A quiet cadet who likes to read poetry." He touched his pocket again. "The difference is that you forgot poetry can be about more than pretty words. Sometimes it's about the fire that burns in the human soul when we're pushed too far. And sometimes," he added finally, looking back at the carnage he had left behind, "it's about teaching bullies that there are consequences for destroying beautiful things." With that, Marcus Chen walked out of Training Bay 7, leaving behind 12 unconscious Zephyrians and a message that would resonate throughout the galactic community. Humanity was not to be trifled with. Marcus Chen walked through the academy corridors with the same measured pace he always used, but there was something different about him now. Other cadets who passed him in the hallway seemed to sense it instinctively, giving him a wider berth than usual without really understanding why. His uniform was still stained with blue Zephyrian blood, and there were small cuts on his hands and face, but he carried himself with the quiet confidence of someone who had just proven something important to himself. With trust Teddy, he made his way to the medical bay, not because his injuries were serious, but because academy regulations required any cadet involved in a physical altercation to report for medical evaluation within 1 hour of the incident. The medical bay was staffed by Dr. Kesserin, a gentle healer caste member of the insectoid Kurtak species, whose 6 delicate arms could perform medical procedures with a precision that rivaled the academy's automated systems. Cadet Chen, Dr. Kesserin's compound eyes focused on him as he entered. "I was not expecting to see you today. What brings you to my medical bay?" "Training accident," Marcus said simply, settling into the examination chair. "Nothing serious, but regulations require a checkup." Dr. Kesserin's antennae twitched in a pattern that indicated curiosity. The Churatak were empathic to some degree, able to sense emotional states through subtle pheromone releases that most other species weren't even aware they produced. "I sense elevated stress hormones, but also something else? Satisfaction, perhaps?" Most cadets who suffer training accidents are frustrated or embarrassed. It was a good learning experience, Marcus replied, wincing slightly as the doctor cleaned a cut on his knuckles with practiced efficiency. The medical bay doors slid open, and Marcus wasn't surprised to see Instructor Vexay enter. The Saurak instructor was one of the most feared figures at the academy, a veteran of multiple conflicts whose scarred hide and missing left eye spoke to a lifetime spent in combat. He was also, Marcus had learned over the past 6 months, one of the most fair-minded instructors in the entire institution. Cadet Chen. Vexay's voice carried the distinctive hiss that marked his reptilian heritage. Doc Kesrin, thank you for contacting me. I understand there has been an incident. As I told the doctor, it was a training accident, Marcus said, meeting the instructor's gaze steadily. Sometimes these things happen during intensive practice sessions. Vex's remaining eye studied Marcus with the penetrating stare of a predator evaluating potential prey. Indeed. And where exactly did this training accident occur? Training Bay 7, sir. Training Bay 7. Vex's tongue flicked out briefly, tasting the air. Saurak's had enhanced senses of smell that could detect chemical traces imperceptible to most other species. Curious. I was just coming from Training Bay 7 myself. Quite an interesting scene I discovered there. Dr. Kesrin's work paused for a moment as her antennae picked up the shift in emotional tension between the two males. Perhaps I should excuse myself, she suggested. No need, Doctor, Vexay replied without taking his eye off Marcus. I believe Cadet Chen is about to provide us with a very illuminating explanation of recent events. Marcus considered his options carefully. The Academy had strict codes regarding violence between cadets, but those codes also recognized the reality that military training involved physical confrontation. The question was how to frame what had occurred in Training Bay 7 in a way that would satisfy Academy justice while protecting himself from retaliation. 12 Zephyrian cadets invited me to participate in a cultural exchange session, Marcus said slowly. They expressed interest in human poetry and wanted to discuss our respective approaches to conflict resolution. Vex's scarred features didn't change expression, but Marcus detected a slight twitch at the corner of his mouth that might have been amusement. And how did this cultural exchange proceed? They taught me about Zephyrian dominance hierarchies. I taught them about human stubbornness. It was very educational for all parties involved. I see. And the current condition of your fellow exchange participants? Resting comfortably. They seemed quite tired after our discussion. Dr. Kesrian's antennae quivered with what Marcus was learning to recognize as barely suppressed amusement. The Kurtak had their own experiences with aggressive species trying to establish dominance through intimidation, and she appeared to be enjoying this particular conversation more than professional decorum probably allowed. Vexay moved closer to Marcus, his enhanced senses no doubt picking up trace chemical signatures that would tell him exactly what had occurred in Training Bay 7. Cadet Chen, in your assessment, did this cultural exchange achieve its intended goals? I believe both sides learned valuable lessons about cross-species communication, sir. There was definitely a greater understanding achieved regarding respective capabilities and limitations. And, in your professional opinion, is there likely to be a need for follow-up cultural exchange sessions? I doubt it, sir. I think the curriculum has been sufficiently covered for the foreseeable future. Vexay nodded slowly. Doctor, what is your medical assessment of Cadet Chen's condition? Dr. Kesrian completed her examination with practiced efficiency. Minor contusions and abrasions consistent with intensive physical training. Elevated, but not dangerous stress hormone levels. Some bruising that will heal within a few days. Nothing that requires restricted duty or extended treatment. Excellent. Vexay turned back to Marcus. Cadet Chen, you will report to my office at 0800 hours tomorrow for a detailed debriefing of this cultural exchange. I am very interested in hearing about these lessons in human stubbornness. Yes, sir. In the meantime, I suggest you return to your quarters and rest. Cultural exchanges can be quite exhausting, I imagine. Marcus stood and gathered his things. Sir, what about the other participants in the exchange? They are receiving appropriate medical attention in the secure wing of the medical facility. Dr. Kesrin's colleagues are quite skilled at treating unconsciousness and various forms of blunt force trauma. I'm sure they will all make full recoveries, though it may take some time. As Marcus headed for the door, HFY called after him. One more thing, Cadet. I understand that Academy property may have been damaged during this exchange. Specifically, I believe a book was destroyed? Marcus's hand went instinctively to his pocket where the fragments of his grandmother's gift rested. Yes, sir. A collection of Earth poetry. It had sentimental value. I see. You should know that the Academy has strict policies regarding the destruction of personal property belonging to cadets. The perpetrators will be held financially responsible for replacement costs, and disciplinary action will be taken as appropriate. Thank you, sir, but I don't think the book can be replaced. It was very old from Earth originally. HFY's expression softened slightly, revealing something that might have been understanding. Perhaps not replaced, but honored. I will see that a full digital archive of the destroyed work is prepared and presented to you as compensation. Sometimes the words themselves survive even when their physical form is lost. Marcus felt a tightness in his throat that he hadn't expected. I would appreciate that, sir. After Marcus left, Dr. Kesrian turned to HFY with obvious curiosity. That was most unusual. 12 Zephyrian cadets unconscious in Training Bay 7, and one human cadet with minor injuries who claims it was a cultural exchange. Indeed, HFY replied, his tongue flicking out to taste the air again. Most unusual. Are you going to file a disciplinary report? HFY considered the question carefully. What would I report? That 12 cadets from an apex predator species apparently learned some valuable lessons about underestimating other species? That one quiet human cadet demonstrated unexpected capabilities when pushed beyond his tolerance threshold? That the Academy's integration program is working exactly as intended? Dr. Kesrian's antennae twitched with amusement. I see your point. And the Zephyrians, when they wake up, will be reminded that the Academy has very strict policies regarding bullying, destruction of personal property, and unprovoked assault on fellow cadets. They will also be assigned to cultural sensitivity training and extensive community service. I suspect their enthusiasm for targeting human cadets will be significantly diminished. And if they seek revenge, HFY's remaining eye glinted with something that might have been anticipation. Then they will learn that Cadet Chen's demonstration today was merely an introduction to human capabilities, not a comprehensive examination. The Academy has several other human cadets who may be equally willing to provide educational experiences. Meanwhile, Marcus made his way back to his quarters, nodding politely to the other cadets he encountered in the corridors. Word of what had happened in Training Bay 7 was already beginning to spread through the Academy's informal communication networks, though the details were becoming more fantastic with each retelling. By the time Marcus reached his dormitory level, the story had already evolved into everything from a single human defeating 20 Zephyrians to an elaborate conspiracy involving human military operatives infiltrating the Academy. The truth, as usual, was both simpler and more complex than the rumors suggested. Marcus entered his small quarters and sat heavily on his sleeping platform. The adrenaline was finally beginning to fade, and he was becoming aware of exactly how much the fight had taken out of him. His hands were shaking slightly, and his muscles ached in ways that reminded him of the worst training sessions on New Montana. He pulled the fragments of his grandmother's book from his pocket and spread them carefully on his desk. Some of the pages were beyond repair, torn too badly to be readable, but others could be salvaged. The poem he had recited to HFY was among the salvageable pieces, the familiar words still clearly visible despite the damage. Marcus began the careful process of sorting the fragments, separating those that could be preserved from those that were lost forever. It was meditative work that reminded him of helping his grandmother with her garden, separating the viable seeds from the chaff that would be discarded. As he worked, he reflected on what had occurred in Training Bay 7. For months, he had followed the path of least resistance, trying to fit into the Academy's social hierarchy without causing trouble. He had endured casual insults and minor humiliations because he believed that demonstrating human adaptability and peaceful intentions was more important than defending his personal dignity. But the destruction of his grandmother's book had crossed a line that Marcus hadn't even realized existed until it was breached. Some things were worth fighting for, regardless of the consequences. Some insults couldn't be ignored without losing something essential about who you were and where you came from. The door chime interrupted his thoughts. Marcus carefully set aside the fragments he was sorting and activated the door controls. To his surprise, he found himself facing 3 other human cadets from his class: Sarah Martinez from the Tau Ceti colonies, David Kim from New Seoul, and Elena Vasquez from the Europa stations. "We heard what happened," Sarah said without preamble. "Are you all right?" Marcus stepped aside to let them enter. "I'm fine. A few bruises, nothing serious." David looked around the small quarters, his gaze settling on the fragments of paper scattered across Marcus's desk. "Is that your grandmother's book? What's left of it?" Marcus returned to his sorting, not really wanting to discuss the fight or its aftermath. Elena moved closer to the desk, studying the damaged pages with obvious anger. "They destroyed your book? Just to be cruel?" "It was a demonstration of dominance," Marcus explained. "Zephyrian's social structure is based on establishing clear hierarchies. They needed to make sure I understood my place." Sarah's expression hardened. "And did you help them understand theirs?" Marcus looked up at his fellow humans, seeing something in their faces that he recognized from his own reflection after the fight. They weren't asking about his welfare out of casual concern. They were asking because what had happened to him could just as easily happen to any of them, and they needed to know if the unspoken rules of engagement at the Academy had changed. "I think there was a mutual learning experience," Marcus said carefully. "The Zephyrians learned that humans don't necessarily follow their expected behavioral patterns. I learned that there are some lines that shouldn't be crossed, regardless of the diplomatic consequences." David nodded slowly. "How bad was it? The fight, 12 against 1. They expected easy prey. They got something else instead." Elena whistled softly. 12? And you're sitting here sorting book pages while they're all in the medical bay? "The medical bay was the intended destination from the beginning," Marcus replied. "The only question was who would be occupying the beds." The 3 cadets exchanged glances that communicated volumes without words. They had all grown up on different worlds, but they shared the common experience of being human in a galaxy that often viewed their species as weak, unimpressive newcomers who had achieved their current status through luck rather than capability. "This changes things," Sarah said finally. "Other species have been testing us since we arrived here, pushing boundaries to see how much we'll take before we push back. Now they know." "Do you think there will be retaliation?" David asked. Marcus considered the question seriously. "Not from the Zephyrians. I think they received a very clear message about the costs of targeting humans. But other species might view this as a challenge that needs to be answered." "Let them," Elena said with a vehemence that surprised Marcus. "I'm tired of being treated like a curiosity or a pet. If they want to test human capabilities, they can learn the same lesson the Zephyrians did." "That's not the Academy way," Sarah pointed out. "We're supposed to be building bridges between species, fostering cooperation and understanding." "And we are," Marcus replied, carefully placing another salvaged page fragment in his preservation pile. "But cooperation has to be mutual. Understanding has to go both ways. If one species thinks they can bully another without consequences, then you don't have cooperation. You have exploitation." David moved to the viewport that looked out over the Academy's training grounds. "My grandfather fought in the border wars against the hegemony," he said quietly. "He always said that peace wasn't the absence of conflict. It was the presence of mutual respect, and sometimes respect has to be earned the hard way." Marcus finished sorting the last of the book fragments and carefully gathered the salvageable pieces. Tomorrow he would begin the process of preserving them properly, finding a way to honor his grandmother's gift even in its damaged state. "There's something else you should know," he said to his fellow humans. "Instructor Vex High is going to want detailed reports from all human cadets about our experiences at the Academy. I think the administration is finally taking notice of the social dynamics that have been developing." "About time," Elena muttered. "I've been filing incident reports for months about harassment and intimidation. Nothing ever came of them. Things are different now," Marcus said with quiet certainty. "Today demonstrated that humans aren't passive victims. That changes the equation significantly." The three cadets stayed for another hour, discussing the implications of the day's events and sharing their own experiences with intimidation and harassment from other species. By the time they left, Marcus felt something he hadn't experienced since arriving at the Academy, a sense of belonging, of being part of something larger than himself. As he prepared for sleep, Marcus reflected on the strange turns his life had taken. He had come to the Academy hoping to prove that humans could be valuable members of the galactic community through diplomacy and peaceful cooperation. Instead, he had ended up proving it through violence and the demonstration of superior combat capabilities. But perhaps that was the real lesson of the day. Humans were complex beings capable of both poetry and warfare, of both gentleness and ruthless efficiency. They could appreciate beauty and create art, but they could also fight with a ferocity that surprised species who mistook their civilized nature for weakness. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and new opportunities to define what it meant to be human in a galaxy full of species that were still learning to understand them. But for tonight, Marcus Chen was content to know that when pushed too far, humanity would push back, and the galaxy was finally beginning to take notice. The next morning brought changes to the Academy that were both subtle and profound. Marcus noticed them immediately as he made his way to the morning meal, the way conversations quieted when he passed, the increased space that other cadets gave him in the corridors, and most tellingly, the careful nods of acknowledgement he received from species that had previously ignored his existence entirely. The mess hall was unusually subdued when he arrived. The Zephyrian tables, normally boisterous with the sounds of competitive conversation and dominance displays, were noticeably quieter. Several of the aliens from yesterday's encounter were absent entirely, still recovering in the medical bay, but those who were present kept their voices low and avoided making eye contact with any of the human cadets. Marcus collected his standard nutrition packet and made his way to his usual table by the viewport. To his surprise, he found it already occupied by Cadet Xeris's valet, a member of the crystalline Thuveron species who had never spoken to him before despite sharing several classes over the past 6 months. "Cadet Chan," Xeris's false voice, resonated with the harmonic overtones characteristic of his people. "I hope you do not mind the intrusion. I was hoping we might have an opportunity to speak." Marcus settled into his chair, noting that their conversation was being observed by cadets from multiple species throughout the mess hall. "Of course. What did you want to discuss?" Xeris's fall's crystalline structure shifted in patterns that Marcus had learned indicated careful consideration. "Among my people, there is a concept that translates roughly as the strength that sleeps until awakened. It refers to individuals who possess great capability but choose not to display it until circumstances require decisive action." "An interesting concept," Marcus replied carefully, beginning to eat his meal while maintaining eye contact with the alien. "Yesterday's events in Training Bay 7 have caused considerable discussion among the non-predator species at the Academy," Xeris's continued. "For months we have watched the Zephyrians and other dominant species establish hierarchies through intimidation and occasional violence. Many of us assumed that humans, like ourselves, would simply adapt to these hierarchies as the path of least resistance." Marcus nodded, understanding where this conversation was heading. "And now? Now we are forced to reconsider our assumptions about human nature and capabilities. The question that many of us are asking is whether yesterday's demonstration represents an aberration or a more fundamental characteristic of your species." The question was diplomatically phrased, but Marcus understood its real meaning. The smaller species at the Academy were trying to determine whether humans could be counted on as allies against the established dominance hierarchies, or whether yesterday's fight was simply an isolated incident that wouldn't be repeated. Speaking only for myself, Marcus said slowly, I would say that humans generally prefer peaceful solutions to conflicts. We value cooperation and mutual understanding. But we also have limits, and when those limits are exceeded, we respond accordingly. Xeris' crystalline form brightened slightly, indicating satisfaction with the answer. And these limits? Are they consistent across your species? Marcus thought about his fellow human cadets and their reactions the previous evening. I believe so. We may have different tolerance levels for different types of provocation, but we all share certain fundamental values. Respect for personal property, for instance. Protection of things we hold dear. The right to be treated with basic dignity. I see. Xeris paused, his internal light patterns indicating deep thought. There is something else you should know. Several species at the Academy have been forming informal alliances for mutual protection. The Thuverans, the Churtak, the Selenites, and others who have found themselves at the bottom of the social hierarchy established by the predator species. That's probably wise, Marcus replied. Numbers can sometimes compensate for individual disadvantages. Indeed, we would be honored if the human cadets would consider joining this alliance. Yesterday's events suggest that humans possess capabilities that would be valuable additions to our mutual defense arrangements. Marcus set down his eating utensil and considered the request carefully. What Xeris was proposing would fundamentally alter the social dynamics at the Academy. Instead of isolated species each trying to find their place in the existing hierarchy, the smaller groups would be banding together to create a power block that could challenge the dominance of the predator species. I'll need to discuss this with my fellow humans, Marcus said finally. But speaking personally, I think the principle of mutual defense makes sense. No one should have to face harassment or intimidation alone. Xeris' satisfaction was visible in the brightening of his crystalline structure. Excellent. We meet this evening after final meal in conference room Delta 7. All species are welcome, but we have kept the meeting small to avoid attracting unwanted attention from the administration or the predator species. After Xeris' left, Marcus found himself approached by cadets from several other species, all wanting to express their appreciation for yesterday's events in their own way. A young Selenite offered him a small crystal formation that represented courage in her culture. Two Churtak engineers presented him with a precision-crafted tool that they had made in their workshop as a token of respect. Most surprising was the visit from Cadet Takmar, a massive granite-class Thuveran whose species was generally considered one of the most physically imposing in the galaxy. Despite their intimidating appearance, the granite Thuverans were actually peaceful by nature, preferring philosophy and artistic expression to violence. Cadet Chen. Dokmar's voice resonated through the stone-like structures of his body, creating harmonic frequencies that were felt as much as heard. I wanted to express my admiration for your actions yesterday. Marcus looked up at the alien, who stood nearly 8 feet tall and weighed close to 400 pounds of living rock. Thank you, but I'm not sure admiration is the right word. It was just something that needed to be done. That is precisely why it deserves admiration, Thokmar replied. Among my people we have a saying, the mountain does not boast of its strength until the earthquake comes. You demonstrated that humans possess hidden depths that are not immediately apparent to casual observation. I think every species has hidden depths, Marcus said diplomatically. The challenge is creating an environment where those depths don't need to be revealed through violence. Thokmar's mineral composition shifted in patterns that indicated deep consideration. Perhaps, but sometimes violence is necessary to create the conditions for peace. Yesterday, you established new parameters for interaction between species at this academy. The predator species now understand that aggression carries risks they had not previously considered. As the morning progressed, Marcus became increasingly aware that his actions in Training Base 7 had created ripple effects that extended far beyond his initial intention of simply defending himself. The Academy's social structure, which had been relatively stable for decades, was suddenly in flux as species reassessed their relationships and alliances. His first class of the day was Advanced Tactical Analysis with Professor Kethmal, and Marcus wasn't surprised to find that the curriculum had been modified to include a case study of asymmetric conflict resolution in multi-species environments. The professor's crystal formations glittered with amusement as she announced the change. Yesterday's events have provided us with an excellent real-world example of how preconceived notions about species capabilities can affect tactical planning, she announced to the class. We will be analyzing the engagement in Training Base 7 from multiple perspectives to understand the factors that contributed to its unexpected outcome. Marcus felt every eye in the classroom turn toward him, but Professor Kethmal continued as if nothing unusual had occurred. The tactical scenario involved 12 members of an apex predator species engaging a single member of what most would consider a mid-tier species in terms of physical capabilities. Based on conventional analysis, the outcome should have been predictable. We saw a complete reversal of expected results. Can anyone suggest factors that might have contributed to this anomaly? A Saurak cadet raised her clawed hand. Environmental advantages? Perhaps the smaller combatant was able to use the training bay facilities to level the playing field. An excellent observation, Professor Kethmal replied. Environmental awareness is indeed a crucial factor in asymmetric combat. What else? The discussion continued for the entire class period, with cadets from various species offering their analysis of the tactical situation. Marcus found it surreal to listen to academic dissection of a fight he had been involved in just 20.5 hours earlier, but he also gained valuable insights into how different species viewed combat and conflict resolution. The Zephyrians in the class remained notably silent during the discussion, their metallic skin showing the stress patterns that indicated deep discomfort with the subject matter. Marcus noticed that several of them kept glancing in his direction, but none of them met his eyes directly when he looked back. After class, Marcus was approached by Cadet Valkyra, a young Saurak female who had been one of the most vocal participants in the discussion. Cadet Chen, she said in the precise, slightly sibilant tones of her species. I wanted to compliment you on your tactical performance yesterday. Your use of environmental advantages and psychological warfare was particularly impressive. Thank you, Marcus replied, though he wasn't entirely comfortable with the clinical way she analyzed what had been, from his perspective, a desperate fight for survival. I am curious about one aspect of your strategy, Valkyra continued. Your willingness to accept significant physical risk in order to eliminate opponents rather than simply defending yourself until help arrived. This suggests a level of commitment to victory that goes beyond normal self-preservation instincts. Marcus considered how to respond to that observation. Sometimes the best defense is to make the cost of aggression too high for your opponents to accept. If I had simply tried to defend myself, they would have eventually worn me down through superior numbers. By taking the offensive, I changed the equation. Valkyra's head tilted in a gesture that indicated fascination. Fascinating. Your species appears to have internalized the principle of escalation dominance in a way that most others have not. You were willing to raise the stakes beyond what your opponents were prepared to pay. I suppose that's one way to look at it. It is a very effective way to look at it, Valkyra replied. I suspect this tactical philosophy extends beyond individual combat to broader strategic thinking. Your species may be more formidable than most of us have realized. As Marcus made his way through the rest of his classes, similar conversations occurred throughout the day. The Academy's academic community was buzzing with analysis and speculation about the implications of yesterday's events, and Marcus found himself being viewed through an entirely new lens by both faculty and fellow cadets. His afternoon training session was held in the same combat simulation center, where he had first demonstrated his capabilities during entrance examinations months earlier. Today, however, the atmosphere was completely different. Instead of being grouped with other low-priority cadets for basic exercises, he found himself assigned to an advanced combat scenarios with some of the Academy's top performers. Instructor Vexay observed the session with the same penetrating stare he always used, but Marcus detected a new level of interest in his evaluation. When the exercise concluded, with Marcus's team achieving the highest score recorded for that particular scenario in over 3 years, Vexay approached him directly. "Cadet Chen, a word if you please." Marcus followed the instructor to a private observation booth overlooking the main training floor. Through the reinforced transparent walls, he could see other cadets engaged in various combat exercises. "Yesterday you mentioned that you would provide a detailed debriefing of the events in Training Base 7, Vexay began. "I find myself particularly interested in your tactical decision-making process during that encounter." Marcus spent the next hour providing a comprehensive analysis of the fight, describing his strategic thinking, environmental considerations, and assessment of opponent capabilities. Vexay listened without interruption, occasionally making notes on a personal datapad. "Your analysis demonstrates a level of tactical sophistication that was not apparent in your previous performance evaluations," Vexay observed when Marcus finished. "Either you have been deliberately concealing your capabilities, or yesterday's circumstances triggered access to abilities that you yourself were not fully aware of." "Probably the latter," Marcus admitted. "My training before coming to the Academy was focused on survival rather than academic warfare. I learned to fight the way colonists fight, out of necessity rather than choice."
"Indeed."
"And this survival-focused training, was it common among human colonial populations?" Marcus nodded. "Pretty much universal. Most human colony worlds have dangerous native life forms that require constant vigilance. Children learn basic combat skills the same way they learn to read or perform mathematical calculations." Vexay's remaining eye glinted with something that might have been anticipation. "Fascinating. Tell me, Cadet Chen, in your opinion, how would other human cadets perform if placed in similar circumstances to those you faced yesterday?" The question was clearly more than academic curiosity. Marcus realized that Vexay was trying to assess whether yesterday's demonstration represented typical human capability or an exceptional individual performance. "I think any of my fellow humans would have responded similarly if pushed far enough," Marcus said honestly. "We may approach the problem differently based on our individual backgrounds, but we all share certain fundamental characteristics: stubbornness, adaptability, and a tendency to escalate conflicts beyond what our opponents expect." "I see." Vexay made another note. "One final question. Do you believe yesterday's events will lead to improved relations between species at this academy? Or will they simply create new forms of conflict?" Marcus considered the question carefully. "I think they'll lead to a better understanding of the real balance of power here. The predator species will learn that aggression has consequences, and the other species will learn that they don't have to accept bullying as inevitable. Whether that leads to improved relations depends on how everyone chooses to use that new understanding." Vexay nodded slowly. "A very astute analysis. You may go, Cadet Chen. I suspect the coming weeks will be quite interesting for all of us." As Marcus left the instructor's office, he reflected on how dramatically his situation had changed in just 24 hours. He had arrived at the academy hoping to quietly complete his training and return to New Montana with new skills and knowledge. Instead, he found himself at the center of a fundamental shift in the academy's social dynamics, representing not just his own interests but those of his entire species. The evening meeting that Xeris' valet had mentioned would be just the beginning. The quiet cadet who liked to read poetry had inadvertently become a catalyst for change that would reshape relationships between species throughout the galactic community. Whether that change would ultimately be positive or negative remained to be seen, but one thing was certain. The galaxy was about to learn a great deal more about what humans were capable of when circumstances required them to stop being diplomatic and start being dangerous. 3 months had passed since the incident in Training Base 7, and the Galactic Military Academy had settled into a new equilibrium that would have been unrecognizable to an observer from the previous semester. The changes had been gradual but profound, rippling outward from that single confrontation to reshape virtually every aspect of cadet life. Marcus Chen stood at the observation deck of the Academy's central spire, looking out over the training grounds where cadets from dozens of species worked together in mixed units that would have been unthinkable just months earlier. Below him, he could see Zefkar leading a joint exercise that included humans, Thuverans, and even some of his own Zephyrian compatriots. The once arrogant alien moved with a careful respect that spoke to hard-learned lessons about the consequences of underestimating other species. The transformation hadn't happened overnight. In the weeks following the Training Base 7 incident, tensions had actually escalated as various species tested the new boundaries that had been established. 3 more fights had occurred, each one reinforcing the message that the days of casual bullying and intimidation were over. The human cadets, emboldened by Marcus's example, had demonstrated a unified willingness to defend themselves and each other that caught the predator species completely off guard. But it wasn't just the humans who had changed. The alliance that Xerxes Villa had proposed had grown into something much larger and more significant than anyone had anticipated. What had started as a mutual defense pact between the Academy's smaller species had evolved into a comprehensive cooperation network that fundamentally altered how training and education were conducted. Marcus turned to see Instructor Vexhay approaching, the Sorak's scarred features showing an expression that might have been satisfaction. "Instructor," Marcus replied, coming to attention. "At ease." Vexhay gestured toward the training grounds below. "I wanted to discuss your upcoming graduation assignment with you." Marcus had been expecting this conversation. Final-year cadets at the Academy were assigned to various positions throughout the Galactic Defense Force, based on their performance evaluations and demonstrated capabilities. Most human cadets could expect assignments to colonial patrol duties or support roles that kept them safely away from the major centers of galactic power. "I had assumed I would be assigned to frontier patrol," Marcus said. "My background makes me well-suited for colonial security work." "Indeed it does," Vexhay agreed. "However, recent events have suggested that your capabilities extend beyond simple colonial security. Your tactical performance, leadership potential, and proven ability to navigate complex interspecies dynamics have caught the attention of some very senior figures in the Defense Force hierarchy." "What kind of attention?" "The kind that leads to assignments that most cadets could only dream of," Vexhay replied. "You are being offered a position with the Multi-Species Integration Command. Specifically, you would be working as a liaison and tactical advisor for joint operations involving human forces and other species." The offer was staggering. The Multi-Species Integration Command was responsible for coordinating military operations between different species throughout the galaxy, one of the most prestigious and influential positions in the entire Defense Force hierarchy. For a human cadet barely out of the Academy to be offered such a role was virtually unprecedented. "Sir, I'm honored by the offer, but I'm not sure I'm qualified for that level of responsibility." Vexhay's remaining eye glinted with what might have been amusement. "Cadet Chen, over the past 3 months you have demonstrated an ability to transform the fundamental social dynamics of an institution that has operated under the same basic principles for over 2 centuries. You have proven that humans possess capabilities that most of the galaxy had not previously recognized. And you have done all of this while maintaining the respect and cooperation of species that were previously convinced of their own superiority." Marcus looked back out at the training grounds, watching a mixed team of cadets work together to solve a complex tactical problem. Among them was Elena Vasquez, who had become an unofficial leader among the human cadets, and Thokmar, whose philosophical insights had proven invaluable in mediating disputes between species with radically different worldviews. "There is something else you should know," Vexhay continued. "The events here at the Academy have attracted attention from the highest levels of galactic government. There are those who believe that humanity's integration into the galactic community has been proceeding too slowly, and that your species has been deliberately underutilized due to misconceptions about your capabilities. And others who think we've been proceeding too quickly? Precisely. There are factions within several species who view recent developments as threatening to the established order. They believe that humans are too unpredictable, too willing to resort to violence, too dangerous to be trusted with significant responsibilities. Marcus understood the implications immediately. His actions in Training Bay 7 hadn't just changed dynamics at the Academy, they had triggered a larger debate about humanity's role in the galactic community. The quiet cadet who had wanted nothing more than to complete his training and go home had inadvertently become a symbol in a political struggle that extended far beyond his personal experience. "What do you think, sir?" Marcus asked. "Should humanity's integration be accelerated or slowed down?" HFY was quiet for a long moment, his scarred features thoughtful. "I think," he said finally, "that integration should proceed at whatever pace allows for genuine understanding between species. What happened here at the Academy wasn't really about humans proving they could fight. It was about humans proving they wouldn't be intimidated, that they have principles they're willing to defend, and that they can earn respect through their actions rather than their pedigree. Those are valuable qualities in any species," Marcus observed. "Indeed they are. Which brings us back to your assignment. The Multi-Species Integration Command needs officers who understand how to build bridges between species, while also ensuring that those bridges are strong enough to withstand the stresses that inevitably arise when different cultures interact." Marcus thought about the fragments of his grandmother's poetry book, now carefully preserved and displayed in his quarters alongside the digital archive that the Academy had prepared. The words had survived even when their physical form had been damaged, just as the essential truths about humanity had survived even when they had been tested by conflict. "I'll need some time to consider the offer," he said finally. "Of course, but while you're considering, there's something else you should see." HFY led Marcus through the Academy corridors to a section he had never visited before, the administrative wing where the senior faculty and visiting dignitaries had their offices. They stopped outside a conference room where voices could be heard through the partially open door. "The Human Integration Symposium," HFY explained quietly. "Representatives from 15 different species have been meeting for the past week to discuss the implications of recent developments. Your name has come up frequently in their discussions." Through the open door, Marcus could see aliens from species he recognized, and others he had never encountered before. At the head of the table sat Admiral Kesther, an ancient selenite whose crystal formations had grown into elaborate patterns that spoke to centuries of accumulated wisdom. "The question before us," the Admiral was saying, "is not whether humans possess the capabilities we have recently observed, but whether they can be trusted to use those capabilities responsibly. The incident at this academy suggests that human patience has limits that may be shorter than we previously believed." "With respect, Admiral," another voice replied. Marcus recognized it as belonging to Commander Yethrock, a Saurok officer who served as liaison to the Galactic Council. "I would suggest that the quiet cadet was chosen as a target. Too late. The instructor arrived after it ended HFY Stories.